Hi, everybody. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to offer you a few tips for the Milestone Two. And first thing I want to say is that these two sections have a tendency to be the most challenging for a lot of students. And so please know that I am here to help. I get that it's a challenge. And most importantly, that this is a draft. So do your best. Definitely follow some of the tips I give you in this video, but don't get too overly stressed out because you are going to get a chance to fix it before it really counts for that final paper. So the first thing I wanted to make sure you noticed is this part of the rubric. Well, actually, I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. Hopefully, by the time you watch this video, you'll have gotten an opportunity to see your paper, and you'll see that I attached a copy of your paper to where you see your feedback, and your paper has comments attached to it that offer questions and specific suggestions. So if you open up the document that's attached to your Milestone 1 feedback, and you can't see these copies, I know sometimes it depends on the device you're on and stuff like that. Please let me know, and I will get another copy out to you, like in a PDF format, so that you can see it. Because part of your grade, as I'm about to show you, let me zoom up here to the rubric. Part of your grade, and actually a big part of it, it's 25% of the Milestone 2. So a fourth of your grade is based on this part right here. Whether or not you took my feedback from Milestone 1 and made changes to it to submit it with your Milestone 2. So the idea is that you're looking at what I wrote, the suggestions and the tips that I gave you and the questions. You make changes to the Milestone 1 portion of your paper, and then you're going to add the Milestone 2 component, so it's going to be one big paper. So you're just turning in the Milestone 1 revised, and again, that is a quarter of your Milestone 2 grade. And then you're going to add these next two sections, the research method section and the outcome section. So let's talk about just a couple of ideas of things for you to include in those. So first of all, in the research method question, it says, how did the researchers test their hypothesis related to the research questions? So and I know that can kind of seem overwhelming. A lot of your articles are very dense and have a lot happening. So to narrow down your thought process, just focus on addressing these questions. And those are, so first of all, what was measured? Like, what were the variables? What were the things that they were measuring in this study? And then secondly, how were they measured? Was it a survey? Was it an interview? Something like that. So I know that can be a little bit challenging. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out about that part. But your grade, because let's be honest, I know we're all kind of worried the most about the grade, right? So the grade is really going to be a good one as long as for this purpose, or for this assignment, as long as you at least tried to address those components. Now there's another piece of the research method section. And now let's talk about the second component of that section. So what, if any, assumptions did the researchers make in order to conduct their research? So remember what you're doing when you're making an assumption. You're like taking something for granted. It's something that you take to be true. And a good example that typically shows up in research might be something kind of related to this study. So this is the study I mentioned in the Milestone 1 video that used to be part of this course. And in this study, the researcher interviewed people that have been convicted of crimes and talked to them specifically about like different fees, fines, like the financial component that's involved when you get a criminal conviction and how it impacts their lives. So typically when a research study involves interviews, a pretty common assumption that they might make is that the interviewees are going to be truthful, because you would think, what's the point of interviewing them if they're not going to be truthful, right? But unfortunately, that's not always the case. There are definitely some reasons that when you're interviewing somebody, somebody might not necessarily tell you the whole truth. And a good place to look to see whether or not, because I know a lot of you guys do have interview as a component, interviews as a component to the study that you chose, a good place to look, because the assumptions, like what the researcher is automatically going to assume, isn't going to be something that's going to be written. Well, it's not normally written. You can do a search through the document for the word assume or assumption, and it is in there occasionally, but it's usually not spelled out. So in this study, when I looked here at limitations, and this is a good place for you to look too, every study should have in it a place where they recognize some limitations that their study has. And even though they don't come out and spell out their assumptions, it's a good place to look to get an idea of what some assumptions might be. And what they did in this study is that they asked in interviews, about on average how much you owe with fines and stuff like that. But they also verified it with public records. But they also said, hey, we couldn't actually find all costs. So their assumption in this case was that, yes, we're going to ask people what their fines and their fees and all their financial obligations are, but our assumption is it could be inaccurate. They might forget, they might have it wrong, or they might just be dishonest. Who knows? So that is something that should be verified through public records, but not all of it could be accounted for. So one of their assumptions is and they don't really spell it out here, but you can kind of assume that there's the potential that some of the numbers and figures that they report in here are not necessarily correct. So again, by far, the assumptions part is the most, is kind of a complicated aspect of the study. So again, this is just provide you with one example. If you have any more specific questions, I'm happy to help. So let's talk about the second part of the research study. And that is talking about the outcomes. What were the major findings? And it's going to be best if you make a connection to the specific research questions in the study. So if they ask some research questions, you can just pretty much just say, what were the answers to those questions? If their purpose, which in several of your studies, the purpose is simply to analyze a situation and see what they can learn about it. Well, what exactly did they learn? So make a specific connection in this paragraph to the research questions and or the purpose, and just be like, hey, this is what they found out, or these are the answers that they got to this question. Now, you would think that all you need to do is put in words what those connections were. And so and this part's a little bit tricky because there's one thing you need to keep in mind, and I am going to use the rubric to show this to you. So looking at outcomes, it says, looking at the rubric to get 100% of your points, it says statistical significance. Now, some of your studies, if they were all interview data, so if it was a descriptive study where there wasn't any kind of statistical analysis done, it's mostly interview information, you're not going to have statistical significance. So you're just going to you're not even going to consider that part of it. I obviously am not going to hold it against you that your study didn't have statistics in it. But a lot of them do feature information. So what you need to look for if you do have a research study that talks about actual statistics is you need to look for something called a p-value. And in this same discussion board post, I've also given you a video that kind of explains the p-value a little bit more. I'm going to try to give you just a real basic explanation of what it is. So this is a little snapshot of another study that we used to do for this course. And they're basically trying to figure out whether or not having some kind of childhood misfortune, so it could be growing up in poverty, being abused, that kind of thing, whether or not there's a relationship between that and whether people end up taking drugs for psychological reasons later on in life. And sorry, there's a big old ambulance sound back there in the background. And as you can see here, it says misfortune increases the likelihood of medication use. So you would think that would be all you would need to say, but you also need to include this little guy right here. And that is the p-value I was talking about. So this is going to be a very, very, very simplistic version of what a p-value is. A p-value is basically a way of saying what's the probability that there really is a relationship or that there's not a relationship. I'm sorry. Let me say that again. What's the probability that this relationship that they found isn't actually true, that it just kind of showed up because of random chance? So notice this number 0.001 is a very, very, very tiny number. That's 1/1000th. That means that there's 1/1000th of a chance, which is a tiny percentage, that this finding was due to some kind of mistake or just random chance. So the way a p-value works is that low p-values are significant. So you would think a bigger number would make it more significant, and that's not the case. It basically, and again, this is very simplistic, it basically means like the probability that this finding is not true. So since it's less than 1 out of 1,000, well, there's a pretty good chance that this finding was definitely correct. So I hope that helps to kind of at least get you started. But again, please know, like I can't say this enough. This is a draft, and I understand that this part can be challenging. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions whatsoever, and I'll be sitting here waiting to help.